Breaking tonight, Australia's energy security just hit a wall that Canberra hoped you'd never notice. The Middle East didn't spiral slowly. It exploded, and Australia is running out of time. Tensions are escalating across the Strait of Hormuz tonight. Iran threatened to destroy any vessel passing through those waters that isn't flying its flag. Global oil markets convulsed. And somewhere in a government statistics office in Canberra, a number sits quietly, almost politely, waiting to detonate. 34 days of diesel, 36 days of petrol. In an emergency scenario, when critical services take priority over public distribution, that buffer shrinks to just 25 days. Everyone believed Australia's geographic isolation would insulate it from Middle Eastern conflict. Economists assumed the war premium would fade within days. Markets expected a quick resolution, another Venezuela, another short shock absorbed and forgotten. Analysts predicted fuel prices would stabilise by the weekend. They were all completely, dangerously wrong. Canberra, end of December. Government fuel stockpile data. The numbers tell a story that Australia's government has been reluctant to shout from the rooftops. At the start of 2026, Australia holds approximately 36 days of petrol and 34 days of diesel, the largest stockpile in 15 years, according to Energy Minister Chris Bowen. That sounds almost reassuring, until you do the math on an actual emergency. In a crisis, when critical services, defence, hospitals, essential logistics take priority over public distribution, those figures drop fast. Effective cover for ordinary Australians, around 25 days of diesel, 26 days of petrol. That's the real buffer standing between the Australian economy and a full-scale energy emergency. Not months, not weeks, weeks barely. Translation: Australia is not watching the Middle East conflict from a safe distance. Australia is one shipping disruption away from fuel rationing, price chaos, and a supply crisis that would ripple through every sector of the economy. And what happened next? The country that built its energy strategy on the assumption that global supply chains would always function, the country that imports roughly 90% of its transport fuel needs, is now staring down the barrel of the most dangerous energy vulnerability in its modern history. Dear viewers, between the moment Iran threatened Strait of Hormuz shipping and this broadcast, something fundamental shifted in Australia's strategic position. The world's most critical maritime choke point, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's traded oil flows, is now effectively under threat. And Australia, distant, comfortable, fuel-importing Australia, has almost no cushion against what comes next. This isn't just about petrol prices at the pump. This is about the architecture of a nation's energy independence and the catastrophic decisions, or non-decisions, made over decades that left Australia so breathtakingly exposed. Let's go deeper, because the crisis has three distinct dimensions and every single one of them hits Australia hard. Dimension 1. The oil price shock. In just 1 week, the international wholesale price of oil surged over 35%, the largest single-week gain in futures trading history, dating back to 1983. Let that number settle. 1 week. 35%. And that's just the beginning. When you pull back further and measure from the start of the year, before the Venezuelan disruption, before the Hormuz crisis, Australia has witnessed an almost 50% rise in the global oil price. The barrel that was trading quietly at $67 the day before the war broke out surged past $90 by the end of the first week and has since broken through $100, the first time it's crossed that threshold since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. It didn't stop there. Brent crude hit $119 intraday before settling back above $100. Markets are now pricing in $135 if the strait stays closed for months. And because Australia imports roughly 90% of its transport fuel, that international price doesn't stay international for long. It becomes your price at the servo. It becomes the cost of your grocery delivery, your freight logistics, your taxi to the airport. Everything that moves in this country moves on imported fuel, and that fuel just became dramatically more expensive. Dimension 2, the gas crisis. Nobody expected. Oil is the headline. But gas is where this story gets even more alarming for Australia's east coast. Here's the detail that most coverage is missing. Qatar alone accounts for roughly 20% of global LNG supply. 20% from one country. And Qatar sits directly in the shadow of the Hormuz crisis. Iran's drone strikes have already hit a major Qatari LNG facility. forcing Qatar to declare force majeure on its gas exports. If those supply lines remain disrupted, the consequences don't stay in the Gulf. They ripple instantly across Asia and Europe. We've already seen it. Gas prices in Asia have surged, and not modestly. The rise in gas prices has actually been far stronger than the rise in oil. That matters enormously for Australia because East Coast domestic gas prices aren't set in a vacuum. They're linked directly to Asian LNG benchmarks. When Asian gas prices spike, Australian households and manufacturers feel that pressure. For now, local gas prices haven't moved dramatically, but the mechanism is in place, the trigger is cocked. One sustained disruption to Gulf LNG exports, and East Coast Australia is looking at an energy bill that most households and businesses simply haven't budgeted for. Dimension 3, the Kuwait signal and the storage trap. Here's a dimension of this crisis that reveals just how deep the problem runs. Kuwait, one of the Gulf's significant oil producers, has begun cutting production, not because demand collapsed, not because the market shifted, but because the Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed to normal shipping traffic and Kuwait is running out of places to store the oil it's already pumping. Think about that carefully. An oil-producing nation is being forced to reduce output not because the oil isn't needed, it desperately is, but because the infrastructure to move it doesn't exist right now. Tanks are filling, storage is maxing out. And when you can't ship, eventually you have to stop pumping. That supply reduction doesn't stay in the Gulf. It hits global markets. It pushes a barrel that already crossed $100 even higher. And then it hits Australia's razor-thin fuel reserve window even harder. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane. It is a structural pillar of the global energy system. And right now Iran is threatening to demolish it. Markets were late. Then they woke up. In the first 24 to 48 hours after the crisis erupted, markets were cautious. The initial oil price reaction was relatively modest. Investors had seen Gulf tensions before, and they'd seen them resolve. They were pricing in a Venezuela-style outcome, sharp shock, quick resolution, back to business. That calculation is now being revised, rapidly and painfully. What's becoming clear to traders, analysts and governments is that this conflict does not look like a short blip. It looks like it could be a far longer, far more structurally damaging event than the market initially priced. And so belatedly, reality is being factored in.
Oil crossing $100 per barrel for the first time since the 2022 Ukraine invasion is not just a number, it is markets recalibrating their entire assumptions set about the duration and depth of this crisis. Analysts at Rystad Energy now warn Brent could hit $135 if the strait stays closed for 4 months. JP Morgan is already telling clients to prepare for production cuts approaching 6 million barrels per day. Australia had hoped to be a bystander.
Instead, it finds itself among the most exposed nations on Earth, and Russia. Russia is watching all of this very carefully. There is one actor in this crisis who is not suffering, one actor who is in fact benefiting from every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains under threat: Russia. A few weeks ago, the United States applied pressure on India, one of the world's largest oil importers, to stop purchasing Russian crude. India and China had become the primary buyers keeping Russian energy revenues flowing despite Western sanctions. Washington told New Delhi enough, but now that prohibition has been quietly reprieved until April 4th. The US rationale: to avoid disrupting global oil supplies at a moment when global oil supplies are already being disrupted by the Gulf crisis. The policy window that Washington opened to pressure India on Russian oil has for now been paused. Translation: Russia's energy revenues just received an unexpected stay of execution. Every barrel of Gulf oil that can't reach the market is a barrel that Russia's customers need from somewhere else. And Russia, sitting outside the Hormuz choke point, is perfectly positioned to be that somewhere else. Moscow didn't fire a shot in this conflict. But Moscow may be its biggest immediate beneficiary. What Australia must reckon with, dear viewers, the fuel reserve window, 25 to 34 days depending on the scenario, is not a policy detail. It is a national emergency waiting to happen. It is the consequence of years of assuming that Australia's geography, its alliances, and the general stability of global energy markets would always provide adequate warning time. The Middle East just proved that warning time is a luxury, not a guarantee. Australia needs a serious, urgent national conversation about fuel security in the same terms that it now discusses defence capability and supply chain resilience. Because a country that can't fuel its trucks, its farms, its emergency services, and its military for more than a few weeks in a crisis is not a sovereign, strategically resilient nation. It is a dependent one, dependent on the hope that distant conflicts resolve themselves before the tank runs dry. The $100 plus barrel, the 35% weekly price surge, the largest in futures trading history, the Kuwait production cuts, the Qatari LNG force majeure. None of these are abstractions. They are the early warning signals of a crisis that Australia is not structurally prepared to absorb. The question is no longer whether Australia is vulnerable. The data has answered that. The question is whether Canberra will act before the 25 days run out. Dear viewers, if this analysis opened your eyes to a vulnerability that the mainstream conversation has largely ignored, then this channel is doing exactly what it was built to do: cut through the noise, follow the data, and tell you the stories that matter before they become the crises you can no longer avoid. Subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And stay with us, because in a world where a single strait can shake an entire continent's energy security overnight, the informed viewer is the prepared viewer. This is Australia's moment of reckoning, and the clock is ticking.